Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale brings inspiration and hope. Today's story is about a remarkable bond between a young woman, Emma, and a forgotten horse, Vela. In a world that seemed to have given up on him, Emma saw potential and love where others saw only scars. Together, they embarked on a journey of healing, resilience, and second chances, proving that kindness can transform even the most broken souls. Stay tuned as we delve into this heartwarming tale of courage and redemption. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us to begin today's story. It was a warm, bustling afternoon at the Springdale auction market, a place alive with chatter, bartering, and the faint smell of hay and leather. Among the livestock and farm equipment, Emma Harper moved with quiet determination. Her eyes scanned the pens, looking for, well, she wasn't quite sure what. She told herself she was just here for supplies. But deep inside, she felt drawn to this place today, as if something was waiting for her. Amid the noise and activity, her gaze fell upon a pen tucked in a shadowy corner. There, a thin, sad-looking horse stood apart from the others. His coat, once lightly gleaming and smooth, was now dull and marred with scars. His head hung low, as if weighed down by more than just age or exhaustion. Yet what struck Emma most were his eyes. Beneath the sorrow, there was something that tugged at her, a flicker of spirit that hadn't yet been extinguished. "How much for this one?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. The handler, a gruff man with a weathered hat, glanced up from his clipboard and smirked. "That bag of bones? $10. If you're feeling generous. Ain't worth much more than dog food." Emma felt her chest tighten at his words. What happened to him? Used to be a racer. Or so they say, the man shrugged. Champion bloodline. But something broke him. He's skittish. Won't pull or race. Can't even stand firm for long. Nobody wants him. So he's just taking up space. Emma's heart ached. She thought of her father, Jack Harper, a man known in Springdale for his gentle hand and wisdom with horses. She remembered sitting in the barn with him as he explained how every horse, no matter its story, deserved respect. "Push a horse too hard," he'd said, carving a wooden horse for her as he spoke, "and you'll break its spirit. But treat it with care, and it'll give you everything it's got." Looking at the horse in front of her, Emma knew she had to act. "I'll take him," she said firmly, pulling out her wallet. She didn't have the full $10 with her but begged the handler to let her pay the rest later. Begrudgingly, he agreed. As Emma led the horse out of the pen with a makeshift rope, she whispered softly, "I'll call you Shadow. You've endured so much. But you're still standing. That's strength. Even if others can't see it yet." The walk back to her small ranch on the edge of town wasn't easy. Shadow stumbled frequently, his weak legs struggling to find their footing. The whispers of passers-by followed them like an unwelcome shadow. "Why would she waste money on that old nag?" one man muttered. "Doesn't she have enough problems already?" another added. Emma ignored them. Her focus was solely on Shadow, who she steadied with each misstep. By the time they reached her modest property, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the hills. Emma tied Shadow to a post and fetched a bucket of water and an old blanket. As he drank, she gently ran her hands along his scarred neck. "You're not broken, Shadow," she murmured. "You've just been waiting for someone to believe in you again." Emma's ranch was no grand estate. It was a humble, weathered plot of land with a small barn and a house that creaked with every breeze. At 22, she had inherited more responsibilities than most her age. After her father's passing and her mother's decline soon after, the weight of their debts and the upkeep of the ranch had fallen squarely on her shoulders. Each day was a battle to keep going, her mornings starting before dawn and her nights filled with quiet moments on the porch, staring at the stars and wondering if life would ever ease its grip. Bringing Shadow home felt different. For the first time in years, Emma felt a fragile but unmistakable spark of hope. Yet that hope was tempered by reality. The next morning, when she opened the door to check on him, Shadow hadn't touched the food she left. He stood motionless, his head drooping, eyes half closed. Emma's heart sank. "Well," she said softly, stepping closer, "it looks like we've got a long road ahead of us." As she approached, Shadow flinched, taking a shaky step back. His body tensed, as though bracing for a blow. Emma stopped, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered. "I promise." It was in that moment she realized the depth of Shadow's wounds. They weren't just physical. His fear and hesitation spoke of a spirit that had been broken long before she'd found him. Healing him would take more than food and shelter. It would take time, patience, and a commitment to earn his trust. That night, as she watched Shadow from her porch, Emma thought of her father again. He would have known what to do. She thought wistfully. But even in his absence, she felt his lessons guide her. "One step at a time," she said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. "We'll figure this out together, Shadow." And so, their journey began. Over the next few days, Emma dedicated herself entirely to Shadow's care. Every morning before heading to her job at Mr. Wallace's ranch, she spent time with him, offering gentle encouragement and fresh feed. Though Shadow still flinched at sudden movements and refused to eat while she stood nearby, Emma noticed small changes. His ears twitched when she spoke, and his eyes seemed less clouded with fear. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the evenings, she sat by his pen, reading aloud from an old book of horse stories her father used to treasure. She wasn't sure if Shadow understood the words, but her calm voice seemed to soothe him. One night, she caught him watching her intently, his dark eyes following the rise and fall of her tone. She smiled, feeling the smallest flicker of hope. "You've got stories too, don't you, Shadow?" she whispered, leaning against the fence. "We'll rewrite yours together." Emma knew she couldn't do it alone. On her day off, she visited Mr. Harris, a retired veterinarian who lived on the outskirts of Springdale. His small house was surrounded by lush pastures and the gentle hum of bees flitting around flowerbeds. Mr. Harris greeted her with a warm but skeptical smile. "So, you're the one who brought home that poor old racer everyone's talking about," he said, adjusting his glasses. "What can I do for you, Emma?" She explained Shadow's condition, from his physical scars to the fear that radiated from him. Mr. Harris listened intently, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he leaned back in his creaky chair and sighed. "That horse's wounds run deeper than skin and bone," he said. "Healing him will take more than medicine. You'll need patience, consistency, and a lot of heart. Horses like him, they've learned not to trust. You'll have to earn it." Though his words carried a heavy weight, Emma left with renewed determination. She spent the next week researching everything she could about rehabilitating mistreated horses. At night, she pored over dusty library books and old notes her father had left behind. Each page felt like a conversation with him, his wisdom guiding her every step. Shadow remained wary, but Emma didn't rush him. She spoke softly, moved slowly, and gave him space when he needed it. Then, one quiet afternoon, as she cleaned his pen, something remarkable happened. Shadow, who usually kept his distance, took a cautious step toward her. Emma froze, unsure if she should move. Slowly, he extended his muzzle, brushing it lightly against her shoulder. Her heart swelled. "So, you're not so afraid anymore, huh?" she said with a gentle smile, holding back tears. Shadow let out a quiet snort, almost as if in response. Emma reached out hesitantly, her hand trembling slightly, when her fingers met his neck. He didn't pull away. The warmth of his coat beneath her palm felt like the first step in a long journey. From that moment on, their bond began to grow. Shadow started eating regularly and even followed Emma around the pen occasionally. His fear hadn't vanished, but it was clear he was beginning to trust her. Emma felt a surge of pride every time he let her get close. Every time he nudged her hand or stood by her side. The villagers, however, weren't as quick to understand. Whispers continued to follow Emma wherever she went. "Why waste time on a horse that's past its prime?" one neighbor scoffed. "She's young. She should be focusing on her future. Not some lost cause," another chimed in. Emma ignored the gossip. She saw something in Shadow that no one else could. Potential. To her, he wasn't just a horse, he was a symbol of resilience. A living reminder of the lessons her father had taught her. One evening, while buying grain at the feed store, she overheard two older men discussing a name she hadn't heard in years: Victor. The name sent a chill down her spine. "Do you remember that jockey?" one of them asked. "Victor, the one who ruined his own horse during the race against Jack Harper?" Emma's ears perked up. She stepped closer, pretending to inspect a sack of feed. "How could I forget?" the other replied, shaking his head. "That poor horse never stood a chance. Victor pushed him too hard. All to beat Jack. And when he lost, he blamed the horse instead of his own arrogance." Emma's heart raced. Could they be talking about Shadow? She waited until they left before returning home, her mind racing with questions. That night, she sat in the barn beside Shadow, her hand resting on his neck. "I think I know your story now," she whispered. "But it's not over yet. We're going to write a new ending together." As Shadow leaned into her touch, Emma felt the weight of her promise. Whatever it took, she would give him the second chance he deserved. Emma couldn't shake the men's conversation about Victor and his infamous race against her father. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. She needed to know the full story, not just for Shadow's sake, but for her own. Her father's legacy was intertwined with this mystery, and she felt compelled to uncover the truth. The next morning, Emma decided to visit Mrs. Clara, the town's unofficial historian. Mrs. Clara had lived in Springdale her entire life and was known for her sharp memory and love of storytelling. Emma found her tending to her garden, humming an old tune. "Emma, dear, what brings you here so early?" Mrs. Clara asked, brushing soil off her hands. Emma explained what she had overheard, her voice tinged with both curiosity and frustration. "I need to know about that race between my dad and Victor. It feels important." Mrs. Clara sighed deeply, her eyes clouding with memories. "Ah, yes. That race. It's a story the town hasn't forgotten, though some would rather it stay buried." She invited Emma inside, settling her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. For a moment, Mrs. Clara seemed lost in thought before she began. "Your father, Jack, was one of the best horsemen this town has ever seen," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He didn't just ride horses, he understood them, respected them. That's why he always won. But Victor, he was different. He saw horses as tools, a means to an end. Winning was all that mattered to him." Mrs. Clara's gaze turned distant as she continued. "The race everyone remembers was the Springdale Derby. Nearly 2 decades ago. Your father rode Stormbreaker, a strong and loyal stallion. Victor's horse was named Valor. He was magnificent. But Victor pushed him too hard. Too fast. Your father warned him. But Victor didn't listen." Emma leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What happened?" "Victor drove Valor into the ground," Mrs. Clara said, her tone heavy with regret. "By the final stretch, the horse was exhausted, his spirit broken. Your father crossed the finish line first. But Victor refused to accept defeat. He blamed Valor, called him worthless, and sold him shortly after. That horse deserved better." Emma felt her throat tighten. She thought of Shadow, his scars, his fear, his resilience. Could Shadow truly be Valor? Everything Mrs. Clara described matched him perfectly. Did anyone ever try to help Valor after that? Emma asked. Mrs. Clara shook her head. Victor's pride and temper drove people away. And by the time anyone could have intervened, The horse was already gone. But your father, he never forgot. He often spoke of how much potential Vela had. If only someone had cared for him properly. As Emma left Mrs. Clara's house, her heart was heavy but determined. Shadow's story wasn't just about survival, it was about redemption. She saw it now, her father's legacy lived on in this horse. And it was her responsibility to honor it. When Emma returned home, she found Shadow standing near the fence. His head raised as if waiting for her. She approached him slowly, her hand outstretched. "You're Vela, aren't you?" she whispered. "You've been through so much. But you're still here. I promise. I won't let you down." Shadow nuzzled her hand. And Emma felt an unspoken bond solidify between them. From that moment on, she called him Vela. The name he was born with, a name that symbolized courage and strength. But Emma's resolve was soon tested. A few days later, an unfamiliar truck pulled up outside her home. A man stepped out, his posture confident and his expression cold. Emma recognized him immediately. "Victor." Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Jack Harper's daughter. Playing horse savior. How quaint." Emma crossed her arms, meeting his gaze without flinching. "What do you want?" "Victor." Victor smirked, motioning toward Vela. "I've come to reclaim my property. That horse belongs to me." Emma's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "You abandoned him years ago. He's mine now." Victor's smile turned sharp. "I have papers proving otherwise. Either you hand him over, or we settle this in court." As Victor left, leaving a legal notice in her hands, Emma felt a surge of anger and fear. She turned to Vela, who stood silently by the fence, his dark eyes watching her. "I won't let him take you," she vowed, stroking his neck. "We've come too far to lose now." That night, Emma stayed up late, poring over the legal notice and drafting a plan. She knew the odds were against her, but she couldn't give up. This fight wasn't just for Vela, it was for her father, for everything he stood for, and for the belief that second chances were worth fighting for. Emma knew she couldn't face Victor alone. His confidence and legal papers were enough to rattle her, but they weren't enough to make her give up. She needed help, and fast. Early the next morning, she drove to the neighboring town to consult Mr. Johnson, a respected lawyer known for his honesty and skill. Mr. Johnson listened intently as Emma recounted everything: the auction where she bought Vela, his condition when she found him, and Victor's sudden reappearance. When she finished, Mr. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "This is a tricky case," he said. "If Victor has papers proving ownership, the court may side with him. But if we can demonstrate abandonment or mistreatment, you have a fighting chance." Emma nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought of court battles and legal jargon. "What do I need to do?" Mr. Johnson handed her a notebook. "Start documenting everything. His condition when you found him, the care you've provided, and any witnesses who can testify to Victor's behavior. Every detail matters." Determined, Emma left the office with a newfound sense of purpose. She spent the next several days gathering evidence. She visited Mr. Theodore, the retired veterinarian who had once examined Vela. He confirmed the horse's poor health and visible scars, which aligned with years of neglect. "He was in bad shape," Mr. Theodore said, shaking his head. "It's a wonder he survived. You've done good work with him, Emma." She also spoke to neighbors who had seen Victor's behavior firsthand. Some were hesitant, fearing repercussions, but others shared stories of Victor's cruelty. "I remember him yelling at that poor horse during training," an older man admitted. "He didn't care about the animal, only about winning." Emma wrote everything down, her notebook filling with testimonies and details. As she worked, the town's gossip began to shift. People who once doubted her now rallied behind her, moved by her determination and Vela's transformation. One afternoon, Emma received a call from a local animal welfare organization. They had heard about her case and wanted to help. "We've been investigating Victor's history," said a representative named Sarah. "We've found records of past complaints about his treatment of animals. It's not much, but it could strengthen your case." Emma thanked Sarah, feeling a spark of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. But Victor wasn't backing down. He escalated his efforts, hiring men to linger near Emma's property and intimidate her. One evening, Emma returned home to find Vela's corral damaged. The wooden beams were splintered, and the gate hung loosely on its hinges. Though Vela was unharmed, the message was clear: Victor wanted to scare her into submission. Emma's fear turned into anger. She repaired the corral herself, her hands trembling with determination. "He won't break us," she told Vela, her voice firm. "Not now. Not ever." Despite the challenges, there were moments of light. Vela's trust in Emma continued to grow. He no longer flinched at her touch and often nuzzled her hand when she brought him food. Watching him regain his strength and spirit reminded Emma why she was fighting so hard. "You've come so far," she whispered to him one evening. "And I promise, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." The day of the trial loomed closer, and the pressure mounted. Emma spent hours organizing her evidence, rehearsing her testimony, and preparing for the courtroom. She knew Victor would try to intimidate her, but she refused to let him win. The night before the trial, Emma sat in Vela's corral, leaning against the fence as the stars twinkled above. She stroked his mane, her heart heavy but determined. "We've got this," she murmured. "No matter what happens tomorrow, we'll face it together." As she sat there, a sense of calm washed over her. The bond she shared with Vela was unbreakable, forged through struggle and resilience. Whatever the outcome, Emma knew she had already won in the ways that mattered most. The morning of the trial arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Emma dressed in her best outfit, hoping to convey confidence even though her hands trembled as she buttoned her shirt. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, taking a deep breath. "You've got this," she whispered to herself before heading out the door. At the courthouse, a small group of supporters had gathered to wish her well. Mrs. Clara was among them, clutching her handbag tightly and offering Emma an encouraging smile. "You've done everything you can, dear. Just speak your truth." Emma nodded, grateful for the show of solidarity. Yet her heart sank as she spotted Victor stepping out of a sleek black car. He was flanked by a lawyer dressed in an expensive suit and carried himself with his usual arrogance. His smirk as he caught sight of Emma only fueled her resolve. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings began with the judge calling for testimonies. Victor's lawyer went first, presenting the papers that claimed his ownership of Vela. The polished legal language and confident delivery made Emma's stomach twist. But she kept her focus steady. When it was her turn, Emma stood and faced the judge, clutching her notebook filled with evidence. Her voice was steady as she recounted the day she found Vela, his deteriorated state, and the months she spent nursing him back to health. She spoke of the scars he bore, both physical and emotional, and how they reflected years of mistreatment. "I didn't just buy a horse that day," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "I found a soul that had been discarded and broken. I've worked tirelessly to rebuild his trust and give him the life he deserves. He's not just a horse to me, his family." The courtroom was silent as Emma continued, her words resonating with those in attendance. Then, one by one, the witnesses she had gathered stepped forward. Mr. Theodore detailed Vela's condition when he first examined him. He was malnourished and skittish, clearly a victim of neglect, he testified. Mrs. Clara spoke next, recounting the stories of Victor's cruelty and the town's collective disdain for his treatment of animals. "We all saw how he pushed his horses to the brink. Vela didn't need training, he needed compassion." The Animal Welfare Organization presented their findings, including records of Victor's past violations and complaints about his behavior. Sarah, the representative, spoke eloquently about the broader issue of animal mistreatment. tying it back to Victor's actions. Victor, for his part, tried to defend himself. He claimed that any perceived neglect was part of rigorous training and that Emma had no right to the horse. But his dismissive attitude and lack of genuine concern for Vela were evident. The judge listened intently, his expression neutral but thoughtful. Finally, the moment came for the verdict. The judge's voice was firm as he addressed the courtroom. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that Mr. Victor not only abandoned the horse but also engaged in behaviors that constitute mistreatment. Legal ownership of the horse is hereby transferred to Miss Emma Harper, who has demonstrated her commitment to the animal's welfare. Relief flooded through Emma as the courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. She had done it. Vela was officially hers. And Victor could no longer threaten their bond. Victor's face turned a deep shade of red as he stormed out of the courtroom. His defeat a bitter pill to swallow. Rumors swirled that he had left town shortly after, his reputation in shambles. But Emma paid him no mind. She had fought for what mattered. And she had won. That evening, Emma stood in Vela's corral, watching him graze peacefully under the setting sun. Tears welled in her eyes as she stroked his mane. "We did it. Vela," she whispered. "No one can take you away from me now." Their journey wasn't over. But in that moment, Emma felt a sense of triumph and peace. She had stood her ground, fought for what was right, and come out stronger for it. And as she looked into Vela's eyes, she knew they were both finally free. The days following the trial brought a whirlwind of emotions for Emma. Relief and joy mingled with exhaustion. And though the battle had been won, she couldn't shake the weight of everything she had endured. She spent long hours with Vela, ensuring he felt safe and secure. The bond they had forged over months of care and trust seemed even stronger now. Word of Emma's victory spread quickly through the town. Neighbors who had once been skeptical began to view her with newfound respect. They marveled at her determination and courage, and many reached out with kind words or small gestures of support. Mrs. Clara, ever the proud mentor, visited often, bringing pies and stories to brighten Emma's days. "You've done more than just win a trial, dear," Mrs. Clara said one afternoon as they sat on the porch. "You've shown this town what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Emma smiled, the warmth of Mrs. Clara's words settling over her like a comforting blanket. But she knew she couldn't stop there. The journey with Vela had opened her eyes to a larger mission, one that went beyond their small victory. The idea of a sanctuary for neglected and abused horses had taken root in her mind. And Emma couldn't ignore it. Vela's story was one of resilience. But she knew many other animals weren't as lucky. She wanted to create a space where they could heal, just as Vela had. With the support of the animal welfare organization, Emma began laying the groundwork for her dream. Sarah, the representative who had testified at the trial, offered her guidance and resources. "We'll help you get started," Sarah said. "But this is your vision, Emma. You've got the passion to make it a reality." Emma threw herself into the project, pouring every ounce of energy into transforming her small plot of land into a haven for horses. She spent hours researching, sketching plans, and reaching out to potential donors. Slowly but surely, the community rallied around her. Local businesses offered materials at discounted prices, and volunteers showed up to help build fences and shelters. One afternoon, as Emma was hammering the final nails into a sturdy new shelter, Mr. Theodore arrived with a truck full of supplies. "Thought you could use these," he said, gesturing to the wooden planks and hay bales. His gruff demeanor couldn't hide the pride in his eyes. "You're doing something good here, Emma." The sanctuary, which Emma named Second Chances Ranch, opened its gates on a crisp autumn morning. The inaugural ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by neighbors, friends, and even a few reporters. Emma stood before the small crowd, her voice steady as she spoke. "This isn't just a place for horses," she said, her gaze sweeping over the audience. It's a place for anyone who believes in the power of compassion and resilience. Every animal that comes here will have a chance to heal, to trust, and to find a new beginning. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Emma felt a swell of pride and gratitude. But the moment that touched her the most came later, when she found Mrs. Clara standing quietly near Vela's corral, wiping tears from her eyes. "He's happy, Emma," Mrs. Clara said, her voice soft. "And so are you. Mitch would be so proud." Over the next few months, Second Chances Ranch became a beacon of hope. Horses arrived from all corners, each with a story of hardship. Emma and her growing team of volunteers worked tirelessly to care for them, finding joy in every small milestone: a horse's first tentative steps outside, a nuzzle of trust, or the sight of them galloping freely across the fields. Emma's bond with Vela remained at the heart of it all. He was her reminder of why she had started this journey and her constant companion as she faced the challenges of running the sanctuary. Together, they had found healing, and now they were helping others do the same. As she watched Vela graze one evening, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the ranch, Emma felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was still long, but she was ready for it. With her father's values guiding her and Vela by her side, she knew they could face anything. Their story was no longer just about survival, it was about creating a legacy of hope. One second chance at a time. As the sun set over Second Chances Ranch, Emma stood by Vela's corral, watching him graze peacefully. The trials they had faced together seemed like distant memories, replaced by the joy of new beginnings. The sanctuary had become more than a home for rescued horses, it was a symbol of hope and resilience. A place where lives were transformed. Emma smiled, her heart full as she reflected on the journey. Vela's strength had inspired her to keep fighting. And now, together, they were making a difference. The sound of laughter and hoofbeats echoed across the ranch, a testament to the lives being touched by her work. This story reminds us of the power of compassion and determination to overcome even the darkest challenges. If you were moved by this tale, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring content. See you in the next video.